What's going on, guys? My name is Andrew Lundy, here with my good buddy Josiah Graves, and we're both about a year into our church plants here in South Florida. Josiah, tell us about your church.
Yeah, so we planted in January of this year, the Exchange Church. Actually, the Refresh Conference prayed over both of us last year, so it's fun to kind of be here with you guys and just review this. And it's been a couple-year process, but it was in January we officially launched. So we're 10 months into it. Started the Gospel of Mark, still in the Gospel of Mark, and it's probably been some of the highest of highs in our life and some of the lowest of lows, but God has been that steady constant throughout.
It's awesome.
How about you? Solus started?
Yeah, we planted Solus Church, kind of started, forming a team last year. We officially had our launch, our opening this year in April. But before that, Josiah, we were both on this sort of church planting track together, about 7 years or so in youth ministry together, and then we both ended up doing a sort of residency program, and it's been a sweet year. And Pastor Daniel asked us to take some time to go through some questions and just kind of have a conversation a bit about how this year has been, looking at how God has worked in our lives, in our churches, and also some of the challenges we faced along the way. There's a few of them. But why don't we start with just kind of focusing on some of the highlights. So, like you said, you opened this year in January. Yeah. Talk about some of the highlights this year of the Exchange.
With church planting, you really just got to have a mindset of we just want to be faithful with the day. We want to plant seeds. We're not looking for crazy fruit right away. But I think for us, in the highlights, when we got to Easter and we saw a couple people come forward, get saved, and one specifically, a person we've been praying for years, the very next weekend he got baptized. And I'd just say, probably for us, baptism has probably been the pinnacle of it. We had a single mom come. She got baptized, brought her baby. We're holding the baby during the baptism. She's getting baptized and comes and hugs the baby. It's just, for us, it's those little victories. Really discovering family, making family. With family comes the family dynamics of stress or conflict or pain, but also walking through that together. So it's probably been the most stretching and challenging and necessary thing in our life. And I'm sure, we've been kind of on, you said, the similar tracks. And I'm sure for you, I want to even say, just for years, man, we've been walking through life together, and I see the call of God on your life. I've seen the call of God in your life, and it's been cool to see your team come together, and you guys officially planted in April, and walk us through some of your highlights last 6 months plus.
Yeah, definitely similarly. I think, the vision for every church planting dream is that you go into your community and you baptize some people. How can they hear without a preacher? That was the cry of our heart with planning our church was, man, we want to go to those who aren't coming. We want to see people come into a real life-changing, life-giving relationship with Jesus. And so we had our first official kind of beach baptism just last month, and saw 7 or 8 people get baptized. And knowing each of those individual stories, I think those are the highlights, which is so important, I think, because when you're building a church, you're planning a church, you're in that process of so much development and hard work, building something that, it's the baptisms, it's the testimonies that remind you that it's about people, it's about someone's, and so I think the same thing, Another thing that I think has been a big highlight for me is a lot of people in our church are those who have kind of for a season become church refugees in a sense, sort of displaced spiritual persons, haven't had a church home, and some people that's just because they just haven't plugged in somewhere, or for others it was because they had really walked away from the Lord and given up on the church. And so for me, I don't know if it's one this day and this event that was the highlight, but when I look back at this year and I see what God's done, I think a highlight is the way in which people who were not walking with God have now come back into a relationship with God and are serving in our church and are on mission. And so that's been, I think, a really sweet thing.
Yeah, I think probably the difficult thing when you talk about church planning or meet with other leaders is they want to know the measurable, what was your measurable goal you hit? And I don't know if it's always super measurable. Right. It could be man, this person prayed publicly for the first time. Yeah. And they started reading their Bible. And this person just started talking about giving. God's made them generous after receiving the gospel. They're now actually giving back. And it's hard sometimes to measure that when it's give us numbers, give us date, give us details. Yeah. And sometimes you just want to celebrate the fact that this person's overcoming sin. Yeah. Or this person who's outside of community is now in community. Yeah. I think those have been the highlights for us, And I think, when we talk about lessons we've learned this last year, the highs, the lows, the the good times, the bad times, the unexpected events that we kind of face. What have been some of those lessons you've learned, and what are some of the things you've hit that you would love to share with others and your perspective this last year?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely knew that like going into the call to church plant that I was going to learn some things, but maybe I didn't realize how much of it would be like just a lesson experience for me. So there's countless things that as a disciple to Jesus, God has been teaching me as his learner, and whether it's through failure or success, trial and error certainly. But I think a lesson I think a big one, just where we're at in this season, is just the lesson of learning how to and aiming to do everything heartily as unto the Lord. And that kind of goes back to what you were saying about like objectives and measurables and metrics. It's tough, right? Because there's this almost like dichotomy of, unless the Lord builds the house, those who labor in vain. And Jesus said, I will build my church. Yeah. Yet there's this call to be like Nehemiah and his men who have a mind to work, and you're laboring and you're serving and you're pursuing in every way to reach people and to build a church. And I think, along the way, the lesson I've constantly had to come back to is not just what am I doing or how am I doing it, but why. Why do I want to articulate the gospel clearly this weekend? Why do I want this event to go off, without a flaw or whatever it may be? Why do I want worship to sound this way? And I think just constantly having to come back to the why of, man, is this something I'm doing heartily as unto the Lord? Is worship my motive? Is that why I'm pursuing excellence? I think that's an ongoing lesson, but certainly a big lesson. What about you?
Yeah, I'd say probably the biggest lesson for us this last year, sometimes when there's a lot of church planning circles or books or gatherings and meetings with people, and you kind of have an expectation or hopes, and I feel like God's had to kind of take a lot of that away and kind of like rewire how I think or how I approach the church in general. But I think the thing we walked away with the most is, before I'm a church planter, like, let's go take the mountain, let's go do this, let's go do this next thing. I think I forget, like, I'm a pastor, and I feel like I'm doing a lot of more of, like, paramedic work, where it's like, we want to go take the mountain, but all of our people are down the hill, like, bruised and injured and hurting. And sometimes before we can go do something, we just need to be and heal and just, preach the gospel to ourselves. Yeah. So I feel like even as we're trying to do a mixture of both, I want to slow down a little bit more and just go, man, like, how's my soul? Like you described, like, why am I doing this? I'd even say, just even for me, like, getting back to, just family and getting back to putting my wife's needs first, putting my kids' needs first. And so, and it's hard because you feel like there's a lot of weight and responsibility pulling at you in different angles. But at the end of the day, I realize that's Jesus's weight to carry. That's not mine. And I'm going to give him my burden. So I think the main takeaway for us this year is, let's pastor people, let's shepherd people, let's love on people, let's serve people. Yeah. And the going and the doing will come from a healthy group of people. Right. So that's kind of been our focus and our aim this last year.
That's cool. I totally can agree with that and attest to that. What about like some surprises? What are some things? I mean, tons of surprises. You're called a church planter. You're called to experience surprises. Yeah. So what are some surprises that have popped up along the way?
I mean, we've had, a mixture of random things. So our first month in the school, we had an atheist guy trying to kick us out. That was a surprise. He drove by, saw our sign, and contacted the Broward School District, and he tried kicking us out. He wanted to see our bill, like, are we paying our bills? How much are we paying? He started giving the school a hard time, showing up on property, taking pictures. One day he was at our school where we meet for church at Quiet Waters Elementary. He was there and he was taking some pictures around 3 o'clock when the kids were getting out. Police officer saw him, gave him a citation saying, you can never be back here at all. Like, you can't be on campus. So and then the police officer spoke to us and said, hey, just want you to know, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, and my God's telling me that your guys are going to be okay. Like, he's not going to bother you again. And so, that was kind of an issue the first couple of months, because you're trying to build a good rapport with the staff, with the principal, with the teachers. And here's this person haunting you on Facebook or following the school around. So that was an unexpected thing. That was kind of minor, but wow. I'd say it's minor because bigger things have been more of whether it's a small conflict or passive aggressive comments that someone can make in passing, and you're trying to go, hey, can we explore that more and look into the heart of that more? How do we actually do conflict well? How do we love each other well? So I think for us, more of an unexpected surprise this year has just been, trying to just work on our team dynamics, have a healthy group of people that are pursuing Jesus together, and saying it's not about what we do, but it's about who we are in the process. So those have been some of our lessons, and
that's good.
I'm sure you've had some surprises too along the way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good story. I don't know if I can beat that one, but
you probably can.
No, but yeah, I think definitely like, you don't realize how many expectations you actually have until you're surprised and you experience, the reality of the journey and as to kind of take another angle, kind of on the more maybe more on the like optimistic side of surprise. Like I definitely didn't anticipate I think I tend to be a little more fatalist sometimes, like let me kind of expect the worst or like pray for the best, like hope for the best, but it's sort of like in my mindset, it's like let me kind of lean into mentally just like the fallenness of man and the impossibility of things apart from God. And so I think that's led me to be surprised by just this might sound funny, but just like surprised by God's faithfulness, which I have no reason to be surprised by God's faithfulness because of how faithful he's been. I was just even reading this morning like a Spurgeon devotion talking about David in the wilderness, questioning if he was going to make it. And Spurgeon was just saying, with David, there was not one entry in David's diary where David could point to and say, oh, here's the reason why God's going to forsake me. And he called it, uncaused mistrust. That's what it is when we don't trust in the faithfulness of God. And so I think, like, this was God's call on both of our lives. Like, we walking through this together, just kind of affirming the same thing you said to me, was like, it was clear that this was something that God was doing, that we were having to be in step with and follow him. And with that, there was this knowledge of, well, if he's calling us to it, he's going to do it. It's his call, it's his church, it's his people.
Yeah.
But to see how evident he's made that and how many just countless ways, that kind of goes back to highlights, but I just think it's just, if anything, I've been surprised by his faithfulness and maybe surprised by my lack of faith in his faithfulness. So I think that's been huge.
Yeah, no, I actually really agree. I think it's funny to me, right before we even said publicly like we feel called to church plant, before we made that known, there was like this internal struggle, this internal battle. I feel like our prayer meetings we're having, or just private prayer, it felt like Jacob wrestling with God, and like God blessed me, and like it's almost as if we're wrestling with God, but we're going to come out limping. I'm going to bless you, but it's going to be painful. And there's a side of this where, I think when it comes to church plan or taking any step of faith, there's a side where you go, God, can I trust you? Yeah. And we all ask ourselves that question. And I feel like for me, there's some fears and just a human side of me that was like keeping me from, stepping out. And there is something about once you step off, like once you take that leap, like if you're going to go cliff jumping into the ocean, once you take that leap, you kind of go, okay, I'm in it. And I'm going to just trust the Lord at this point. And like, it was just so hard to make that first initial leap for us. And that has been like the best I think we've ever could have done. Right. It's just taking that like first, like, here we go. Right. Because once you say it, once it's out there and once it's known and you're what you're pursuing, it was terrifying. Yeah. But God has been way more faithful than we have. And I so agree, like when we met as a church, we shared that. Like God is faithful even when we're faithless. Yeah. Because he cannot deny who he is. Right. And so that's been like that has surprised me the most too, is God has exceeded our expectations, and that is the most humbling thing. And it's not because of anything we've done; it's just because He's faithful. Yeah. But we gotta take that initial step of faith. Right. Without faith, it's impossible to please Him. And so that's what we've been learning as well. It's almost like this reckless abandonment of I'm going for it completely. You can't get faith in seminary. Faith is like the gift of God, right? God has dealt to each one a measure of faith, and there is that at the end of the day that like. Non-negotiable in the call of like at the end of the day it's gonna have to be walked in. It's gonna have to be walked out. Like every call of God is not meant to just be received, it's meant to be walked out, otherwise it's a missed call. And I can't underestimate too, and just agreeing with like just the value of that. Like it's just you eventually gotta step on the Jordan. Eventually you gotta go, and you take what God spoke to you, and people think you're crazy and it doesn't make sense and it doesn't line up, and you don't have all the answers. But you get to see God, as we're saying. It's so much better, right? Like than having all the solutions. I think G.K. Chesterton says, like, I prefer the riddles of God over the solutions of man. And it's like, man, seeing how God's been able to show up. You can't learn that. That's good. Yeah.
So Joe, I mean, is there a final encouraging word that you give to a future church planner or church planner along the way?
Yeah, I mean, you're probably already doing this, and it's probably an internal battle you're having, but I think of 1 Corinthians 4, where Paul says, I don't judge myself or let another man judge me. Each one's praise will come from God. And so that section of Scripture has really challenged me just to go to the Lord and say, God, here's my motives, and a lot of them aren't good, and a lot of them need refining, and I want it to be about the gospel, and I can tell people gospel-centered, Christ-centered answers, but Lord, you know my real heart. And so my encouragement to you guys is just have that internal wrestle before the Lord. Tell him the areas of your life where maybe your motives are off. Confess that, be open, be honest. Let him purify that. I think that process, that internal struggle is a good thing. Don't just skip over that and say, I'm going. I would say really wrestle with the Lord and let him push and challenge and purify your heart in the process and purify your motives in the process.
So good.
How about you?
I mean, I don't mean to give a Sunday school answer, but I would just tell you to make it your primary aim to pray and to create time for that, to schedule time for that. I think the scary thing is you can plan a church without praying. Mm-hmm. I mean, in the sense that you can get a crowd, you can build this thing. If you have enough funding, you can make this thing happen. But it kind of goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning of, unless the Lord builds the house, those who labor in vain. And you could do this with kind of a mediocre prayer life, but don't. Mm-hmm. I think that's something that we've had to come back to is, God, we can't do this. We can't do this in a way that impacts your kingdom the way we want it and gives you all the glory, Jesus. Mm-hmm. So we're really only as dependent on God as we're praying. And the flip side of that is when we pray, it's amazing to see how God hears our prayers and he answers them. Mm-hmm. So see prayer as actually the greatest gift that you could give to your church. Mm-hmm. Not your preaching, not your creativity, not your leadership, but your prayers. And if you understand prayer as the greatest work of church planning, I think you're in to see, again, what we talked about, the faithfulness of God around every corner.
It's good.